couple more people coming on now. Right, just another minute or so, guys, and then we'll get started. That's one thing we all need this evening is a lot of water.
We need to start getting up into Thomas H. Handy and George T Stag and William Weller. It's all cast strength.
The most cask strength, I think.
That's yeah, and after that's when all the really difficult questions start coming in. You know, after the cast strength stuff.
Yeah, it's always a little bit quieter at the start. You know,
I see a wry smile on Shane's face there. He's got a few post-it notes on the desk ready to go here.
Right, so I think we'll get started, and then I'll just admit there'll be a couple of people. There's another one there. That'll be coming in, I'm sure, in the next couple of minutes, but sure, we'll get started. So what I'll do is just ask you all to just stay muted, and myself, George, and Ian will get cracking here. Perfect. Okay, folks, so welcome to Celtic Whiskey Fest. I don't know if this is your first tasting so far, but it's my first tasting so far. So tonight we're doing the BuffaloTrace Antique Collection. So Ian and George will take us through 5 different whiskies, of which we have the running order. So I'll be able to pop that into the chat and let you know what order we're going in. And as we're going, like I said, don't be afraid to add water if need be. These are more or less all cask strength. Some quite old bourbon as well. And no one really came here to listen to me talk. We want to get started on these whiskeys. So if you have any questions at all, pop them into the chat and I'll forward them on to George and Ian, and let's enjoy them. So guys, if you'd like to get started.
Sure, thanks very much indeed, Tom. And indeed, welcome everybody to Celtic Whiskey Fest and to the BuffaloTrace Antique Collection tasting. Myself and Ian work together. We work for Sazerac, who's the company that owns the BuffaloTrace distillery, and we work in the sales and marketing team here in Ireland. So you're all very welcome, and thanks for carving a chunk out of your Saturday night to hang out with us while we talk about a little bit of whiskey. And I suppose, as Tom has said, while myself and Ian will probably end up doing most of the talking, we'll kind of go back and forth to each other. But as we go, any questions, any comments, any stories or yarns you want to share, please by all means use the chat function on the Zoom call, or of course unmute as well, and be delighted to chat with you guys as we go. So I suppose, Ian, we're here to drink some whiskey, so I think we should probably start drinking some whiskey. What do you think? And we'll start off with a little pour.
Yeah, we'll get everyone loosened up a little bit, and then we'll start worrying about a bit of history and a bit of fun facts. So we're going straight into Eagle Rare 17. So we're going to the second oldest whiskey in our tasting bunch. So Eagle Rare 17, for kind of those who are familiar with Eagle Rare and the BuffaloTrace brands. So they're all made from our mash bill number 1, which makes BuffaloTrace, Eagle Rare, our George T Stag, a lot of the E.H. Taylors as well. So it's all that similar mash bill. So George will touch on, I suppose, what makes bourbon and more preciseness around the mash bills, but we don't know what the exact proportions in the mash bill. You're probably talking it's a high corn mash bill in BuffaloTrace, so it could be 70, could be 80% corn, and then rye, malt, and barley. where you want to get from Eagle Rare is because it's in oak a long time. 17 years in oak is, well, it's probably mid-20s, early 30s level of Irish whiskey aging of barrel interaction, because you've such a warm climate, your humidity is so much higher, your temperature is so much higher in the summer in Kentucky. Myself and George were there 3 years ago now, I think, July 3 years ago, and it was 42 degrees centigrade when we were there. It was scorching. So
we have to I suppose we'll throw in fun facts and interesting things as we go, as try and help the session along. We actually closed the still house for the month of July in BuffaloTrace, for the simple reason that it's too hot and too dangerous for people to work up on the catwalks, on the gantries, up in the very across the top of the stills, because as Ian mentioned, it can touch early to mid 40s, but in the still house it's well into the 50s up at the roof. So we can't have people up there because we don't want anybody to pass out and fall into one of the fermenters or anything like that. That would not be a good press release to have. So that's because at the very peak of the summer, we actually down tools, we get all our fitters in, so we get all the plumbers, welders and everybody else in, and do all the repairs, do all the pressure testing and all that kind of thing, and all of the vessels, and make sure that we're ready to go for the following season, which starts sort of mid-August. So we down tools really for about 4 to 5 weeks, pull the whole thing apart, put it back together, and then get ready for the next season.
So that's that's enough little bit of talking. So look, go straight into Eagle Rare 17. And look, we'll if anyone wants to put through any tasting notes in the chat, please do. This is Eagle Rare 17 you have tonight. We're actually due to our allocation of what we receive in Ireland. This is actually a slightly older bottle, and so it's from 2017, and it's at the 90 proof or 45% ABV. In 2018 they moved it to 101 proof, which was the historic proof of Eagle Rare back in the 80s, 70s and 80s. So unfortunately, just we get so little of this stuff. This was just happened to be with a couple of extra bottles of 17 from somewhere later, came out of the woodwork. So that's what you guys have here tonight. So I'm not going to tell you what you're tasting. Have a taste, have a sip, because these are quite old. I kind of implore you to chew them a bit. It's like the Kentucky chew. So just slosh it around your mouth, give it a good chew, and it'll start to open up as your saliva glands start to activate. You'll start to put the whiskey. This is more and more important, especially for the cask strength. Eagle Rare not so much, but you have a lot of oak in this whiskey, a lot of tannins, and you're going to get two different types of spice, particularly with Eagle Rare 17. You're going to get barrel spice and you're going to get rye spice. So you can tell me which is which, but yeah, look, just launch it. And
launch here, good health, and thanks for joining us.
It's fascinating. It's very creamy, I must say.
So that's, I suppose, to touch on the mash bill and talk a little bit about what makes this whiskey a bourbon as opposed to just a whiskey or a Tennessee sour mash or just an American whiskey. There are 5 main rules about bourbon, and we'll talk about these a little bit as we go during the session. And these have come, I suppose, through hundreds of years of trial and error through the making of American whiskey. But I think fair to say that the regulations around what needs to be true for you to call your whiskey a bourbon are probably the tightest whiskey regulations in the world. They're certainly much tighter than the Irish whiskey file. Anything I've seen on the likes of Japanese or Canadian whiskey, there's a book that thick, and it's all enshrined in federal law in the United States, so it applies to the entire United States. But without rabbit holing on that too much, Tom, you make a very good point there in terms of mouthfeel and roundness, and one of the rules of calling your whiskey bourbon is that the grain and the mash that we put into the mash has to be a majority of corn, and it has to be 51%. So corn or maize, obviously, is anybody who's ever opened a tin of sweet corn, you'll know it's a sweet grain. So it's excellent for distilling. There's a lot of sugars we can pull out to ferment and begin to create alcohol from. And one of the beauties of bourbon is that sweetness carries through all the way from the grain through the distillate and through to maturity as well. So what you get is you get the sugars that are in maize or corn would carry quite a decent oil content. So bourbons tend to have a creamier or oilier mouthfeel, which means they will coat your mouth a bit better, a bit longer lasting, and tend to be a bit more rounded as well. So you don't get a punch of alcohol on your tongue. You get a nice sort of smoother delivery with the whiskey. So that's, I suppose, that's probably what you're finding coming through. Okay, as I said, but myself and Ian, just so you know, guys, our style is not really to tell you what you're smelling or tasting, because this is not a Paul McKenna mind hypnotist show. We don't want to plant ideas in your head. It's totally subjective for each and every single one of you who are joining us this evening. So I see a couple of you put some chats in there in terms of some vanilla notes coming through and that kind of thing. So the typical characteristics you get from bourbon will be toffee, vanilla, caramel type of notes. And again, that's the sweetness and the toast from the barrel coming through. So some sort of butterscotchy caramelly notes would always be present in bourbon.
Yeah, and just Darren has said, that you would touch on there.
Yeah, generally, Darren, it is. It's always actually one of the rarest. One of the rarer bourbons. I think we got 3 bottles. I think 2018. I think of Vigorous was one single case, and it's generally due to its age. So it's one of the older, and to meet, I suppose, it suffers with very high evaporation loss. So in general, we lose about 10% of the barrel in the first year, and it's anywhere from 4 to 6% a year thereafter. And the particular release that you're drinking now was had an 89.5% evaporation loss that year. So it was only 36 barrels. So we think about how much was actually made the year. So 36 200-liter barrels and 89, just 90% of those 200-liter barrels survived. So that's, you know what I mean? The math is
crazy to think about, yeah.
So that's why it's always so rare. It just suffers from the style of Eagle Rare, where it sits in different warehouses. It always suffers pretty badly with evaporation loss. But look, it is what it is. It's it always delivers, and I think it's quite interesting. And just the John's there, strong vanilla notes, absolutely, lots of vanilla. And it'd be, for me, I mentioned that spice, so I always get like the rice spice from the tip of the tongue, so the real white pepper spice, and then it starts to dissipate, and then you get a lot of dry tannins on the side of your cheeks. So you're getting tannins from the barrel essentially. So it's no different than drinking a big red wine or a really heavy oak Chardonnay or something.
I just find it actually has a menthol finish on it, a little bit on the kind of side of the mouth there.
You'll always get like deeper, darker cherries and like, you know, those darker, deeper fruits, and especially when you get higher into the ABV or higher into the age in bourbons, you get, especially like rye bourbons, and even some of the older pappies, for instance, you get a lot of that tobacco note, and that's all coming from the influence from the barrel, from the cask. So like all the barrels of BuffaloTrace are all char 4, which is a 55-second char, so it's quite a deep char. That's where that kind of maybe oaky or that tobacco or kind of flavor profile is coming from. So that's it. Everybody like it? Yeah,
thumbs up from me anyway.
Yeah. It's a cracking drop. I wish we got more of it. Like everything, like all of these, I wish we get more of them all, but don't always.
But it's I think it's amazing value. The original Eagle Rare as well. Like, it's fantastic. 10-year-old bourbon for €50, what we sell it for in the shop. It's easily one of our best selling. There you are, if you can see it. It's one of the best selling bourbons we have in the shop.
Yeah, I think so. Eagle Rare, for me, like, we get a staff allowance off George every year, and my staff allowance every year without fail has a case of Eagle Rare in it, without fail. It is, if I don't drink another whiskey all year and it's Eagle Rare, I'm happy. That's just the way it's.
Be happy with that one.
Yeah, I think it's I suppose working for an American company, Tom, we have a fight every year on our hands when the allocations come out. I have to get on the phone and start polite and finish angry and try and get some bourbon out of them. But to be fair, as Ian mentioned, there was one year where it was about 89 or 90% evaporation across just 36 barrels, and they just had to make a tough decision and say, we're not allocating a drop outside of the United States, and that was it. And we had no Eagle 17 that year, and on we went. So that it just happens. And I suppose at the end of the day, sometimes we don't know until we go to disgorge the barrel and we go, oh, we only got 2 liters out of that one.
2 teaspoons, yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to just touch on one thing, which is cutting bourbon with water. You need to do it very carefully, guys. It's very different. If I go to an extreme and talk about like a 12 or 14-year-old Islay single malt Scotch, which is very peaty, and you can kind of sploosh in a drop of water out of a bottle or out of a glass, I would recommend that if you're going to add a little drop of water, that you do it literally a few drops at a time, possibly using a teaspoon, something like that. The reason is it's very, because of the sugars in bourbon, it's very easy to just over dilute it and kill the flavor very quickly. So there is a tipping point, and once you go beyond it, there's no coming back. So particularly as we go on through the tasting, as Ian said, we're going to get into some fairly high proof stuff. And of course, in terms of balancing the mouthfeel, you may want to cut a little bit. So if you have a little bit of room temperature water, a teaspoon, or if you have a pipette or something like that you stole from high school in the house, literally a few drops at a time, given the size of the samples, is how I'd recommend you do it, because as I said, you can over dilute very quickly. So just a little tip on that. Okay, the rye not so much, but certainly with the few bourbons we're having, just slowly is the way to go. Okay, so when we're finishing off that sip, just a couple of other things just to give you some highlights of the Bourbon Rules, and there are really 5 of them, which one of which I've touched on so far, which is that the majority of the mash bill, the grain we use to create the distillate, has to be corn. Okay, the second rule may or may not come as no surprise, is that you must complete the entire process within the United States of America. Okay, so there's no such thing as Irish bourbon, Canadian bourbon, Mexican bourbon. It has to be within the United States of America. Now, there is a misnomer that it has to be in Kentucky. It actually doesn't have to be in Kentucky, but Kentucky is particularly good for making whiskey because the bedrock in Kentucky is limestone, which is very good for filtering natural water, but it also adds really good minerals, which make it very, very good water for natural water for distilling. So that's why Kentucky kind of became a big center for distilling, particularly for bourbon in the US. But there are some great bourbons coming out of New York, Colorado. I believe there's a distillery has been laid down in Alaska. So anywhere within the 50 countries that make up the United States, you can call your whiskey a bourbon. So that's one of the other rules. Couple other things as well. You can't, the distillate that we make, we are not allowed to distill it higher than 120 proof. 120 proof is about 60% ABV as it comes off the still. The reason for that is once you go above 120 proof, essentially what you're doing is making a vodka. You're actually beginning to strip flavor back out of the distillate. And of course, bourbon has a reputation for being very flavorsome, as some of you have put into this. Sorry, 160 proof, thanks Ian. And it has a reputation and a standard for being very flavorful. And if you start making a vodka, of course, you're stripping flavor out and you're just really getting to quite a neutral spirit. So that's one of the other rules. One of the other things as well, it has to be aged in a brand new oak barrel every single time. So you have to go to a cooperage, get a brand new barrel. Ian has mentioned in BuffaloTrace, we go to a place called Independent Stave in Lebanon, Kentucky, and all of our barrels are charred for 55 seconds. And what that does is basically fractures and cracks open and toasts all the resins and all the good minerals and indeed more sugars as well from the resin in the barrel. It also increases the working surface of the inside of the barrel. But it has to be a brand new barrel every time. So literally every time we roll a barrel and disgorge it, we then have to discard the barrel. So this is why if you've ever been in an Irish distillery, you will see, you may see some BuffaloTrace barrels there. You'll see them from Beam, you'll see them from Maker's Mark and many other distilleries around the place. And because the whiskey that's been in those barrels has that lovely sweeter note to it, a lot of Irish and Scotch and Japanese and Canadian distilleries like to put that finish on their whiskeys. So they take a bit of the flavor and impart it into the Irish whiskey. So I suppose the way what I always compare that to is a tea bag when you're making a cup of tea. And if you can imagine that the 12 or 14 of us where we're all going to make a cup of tea, but we're only going to use one tea bag. And if Tom started it, he'd have a very strong cup of tea. And then it went to me, my cup of tea would be a little bit weaker, and then on to Ian and so on. So the reason that we go for new barrels every time is because we get to essentially wring all the tea out of the tea bag, and we get all the flavor into our whiskey. And that's the reason. Now, obviously, we do leave a bit behind, which Irish and Scotch distillers like to use to flavor their whiskies. The final kind of main rule on bourbon is the only thing we are allowed to add to our product, so it comes off the still and it's as clear as the glass of water I have there, so absolutely crystal clear. The only thing we're allowed to add to that distillate is a toasted barrel. That's it. There are no colors, no flavors, no preservatives. We're not allowed to add caramel to make it look a bit more whiskey-ish. We're not allowed to add sugar to make it a bit sweeter or anything like that. So once it comes off the still and it goes into the barrel, that's it. And you can see behind Ian here, this is I think it's warehouse C or D in Buffalo, in BuffaloTrace, and they go in there and they stay there for however many years, and that's all we're allowed to do is put the distillate in the barrel, put the barrel in the warehouse, and that's it. Now, when it comes out of the barrel, we can adjust the proof, but so the reason I bring that to your attention is the whiskey you're tasting is probably one of the purest whiskies in the world, because even in Irish whiskey and in some Scotch whiskies, sometimes you'll read the back label and you'll see there's a reference to say we've added a bit of caramel color, or in other markets they might add a bit of flavor to their whiskey, but that will never happen if you're drinking a bourbon. Even a very good value bourbon that might be, I don't know, 20 or 25 euro, nothing will have been done to that whiskey except it sat in a barrel for a few years. So it's a very, very pure tradition and a very pure spirit that you're drinking, and realize the quality of it as well. Okay, so right, enough waffling from me. Ian, back over to you. We'll drink a little bit more of the good stuff.
So we're on to Sazerac 18 now. So obviously our first whiskey is a bourbon, and now we're on to a rye. So as George mentioned, some of the rules of bourbon. Your dominant grain is corn. So to be a rye whiskey, it's dominant grain is rye. Your other two components of the mash bill are generally corn and malted barley. So just it takes a flip. So this is Sazerac 18. It's our rye recipe. So from BuffaloTrace, we make from this recipe Sazerac 6-year-old rye, Sazerac 18, Thomas H. Handy, and essentially they're all the same mash bill, and they're just aged different for different years and different and these different strengths. So like Thomas H. Handy, when we get to it, is cask strength 6-year-old Sazerac rye. That's essentially what it is, but it's how you, I suppose, every of those bottles is going to be different because each warehouse is different and it's going to give different things. So this particular Sazerac 18 we're drinking is the 2020 release, so it's the most recent release we have here in Ireland, and it was aged for 18 years and 4 months. So like you go back, think about 18 years listening to a barrel. What were you doing 18 years ago? I definitely wasn't sitting drinking whiskey anyway, that's for sure.
Not legally anyway.
I don't think I was even old enough to do that. I don't think I was that brazen even at that age. George is definitely drinking whiskey because he's old,
Thanks, Ian. Appreciate that, man.
But yeah, 18 years is a long time. So this particular whiskey was aged in Warehouse K. It's one of our kind of older stone warehouses as well, but it's exclusively in Warehouse K. Normally for the BuffaloTrace and Tea collection, you would have a couple of different barrels from different warehouses, because when Drew Mabel, our master blender, picks pretty much he picks the barrels for the antique collection every year. He has, I suppose, what we call our honey spots, or our spots we know in the warehouse make exceptional bourbon, and that's where the antique collection is sought from every year. And they would have eyed up barrels of bourbon years in advance. So yeah, it's quite unusual for one of the bourbons just to come from one specific warehouse, which is, it's quite unique. And these all came from the third floor as well, so which is actually quite strange as well for an 18-year-old whiskey as well. So most of those older warehouses are all four stories. So it was on the upper side of the warehouse. So like it's obviously going to suffer quite a bit of high bit of evaporation. So they'd also think just shy of 77% of the barrels on average for this release. But what I expect, I haven't tasted this yet, so I expect this to probably have a lot more oak interaction than you would normally get from Sazerac rye, because mostly Sazerac 18 is aged in the lower floors. So I'm actually quite looking forward to trying this Sazerac 18, because it's quite unusual. Any of the BuffaloTrace and Tea Collection days we've done, these never came from the upper floors or towards the higher end of the floors. It was always floor 1 or 2. So yeah, look, it's launch it. Cheers, and let's
Cheers.
drink.
I must say, on the nose, I don't know if anyone remembers macaroon bars, but that's the kind of smell I'm getting. I know that's
yeah, I do actually, yeah, because there's that faint sweetness, and then there's that that funny sticky, like, I know exactly.
Yeah, I don't know how else to explain it, but that's
it's just very nearly that deep sweetness, like molasses or aniseed in it as well. Yeah, on the initial taste as well.
It's always that, like, Sazerac 18 generally always has like a clove kind of dryness. The nutmeg, that almondy flavor as well. It's always quite typical. So wow, that's so different to what's come before it anyway. Wow.
It's much smoother. That's my first time tasting the 2020 as well. Because I know previous in 2019, 2018, it was, my God, it was like getting punched in the mouth with rye. It was really spicy and prickly, and that heat seems to have tempered down a little bit on it. It's very, very nice. Very nice.
Yeah, it's really sweet up top.
Yeah, there's a lot of sweetness there, and there's a lot of depth to it actually. And like, so Sazerac 18 up until 2018 was a lot of tanked Sazerac rye, so we had a lot of older Sazerac 8. So Sazerac 18 was the same for 2 or 3 years, I think, from the Antique Collection. So I think it's from 2019 it was our first straight 18-year-old into a barrel release. So yeah, this is the second one, I think, and yeah, it's really good. Quite different. Like, I think it's so different. People either like the rye or they won't. It's a very Marmite thing. Yeah, and John, it does feel very different because you're dominant. You don't have the extra corn, so you don't have the extra sweetness. So your rye grain is more dominant. So you get more influence from the rye in the mash bill. So you'll have a lot more dryness and you'll have a lot more spice. Typical. There's a little more white pepper spice on this, but yeah, it's completely different.
You'll also notice that you get the flavor. Again, this is the mind game moment, but you actually get it. The flavor interaction on your tongue is different. It's more down the sides of your tongue where you pick up those sort of spicier, peppery notes. So you'll notice the top of your tongue is a little flatter right now. You're not picking up the some of the sweeter ones. So it's again, it's the interaction with your taste buds and your senses is a little different with a rye as well. One thing I wanted to touch on, Ian, was just without turning this into a high school history lesson, but just to touch on, I suppose you mentioned that Drew, who's our master blender, and Harlan, who's our master distiller, they have encyclopedia of notes of, depending on which floor, in which warehouse, which rack, and which whiskey goes into it, they know pretty much how it's going to behave. And the reason for that is because the master distiller's notes have been handed down from one master distiller to the other. And where BuffaloTrace is here in the background, where you see behind Ian's head and behind myself here, you can see the cistern room where we do some of the disgorging of the barrels. The originally distilling started on this site as far back as 1773, so BuffaloTrace today is the name of the town is Frankfort in Kentucky, but back then it was Leestown, and there were two brothers by the name of Lee who settled in the area, and they were originally European farmers. So they came in, farmed a little bit, and then began to distill with some of their surplus grain, and that's kind of how distilling began in the area. So I suppose over the last, I'm not going to do fast maths on this, but over about the last 230, 240, 50 odd years, obviously the notes have been handed down. We found a lot in the town archives as well. So the guys know if they put this barrel, fill it with this whiskey, and put it on that floor in that warehouse, they have a pretty good idea how it's going to behave and how long it needs to be there. So they'll know if they put a rye into that third floor warehouse in Warehouse K in 18 years' time, they're going to have a pretty good bottle of Sazerac 18 for their antique collection. So they're always trying to forecast ahead. And that's the tricky thing with whiskey. It's very different to gin or vodka that you can make, I suppose, in a week or 10 days. With whiskey, you always have to try and see into the future. And with these ones in particular, some of these you're seeing into the future as much as 18 years. So it's, I think Ian raised a very good point. Where were you 18 years ago? I was at a very different place, probably off in Australia, bouncing around, doing all sorts of things before I got serious about life. So, but it's nice to have a think back to where you were 18 years ago and think that's when this whiskey went into the barrel. So it's nice to kind of put yourself then into the future now and go, right, here we are, 2021. We won't get into all the delights and surprises that 2020 and 2021 have brought us, of course, but it's not nice to I think it's a very nice tip for me, and it's nice when you're drinking an aged whiskey like that to cast your thoughts back a little bit as well. But I suppose back to the history of the place, as I said, it's been running there for about 240, 250 years in the same site, and we keep expanding and adding bits and modernizing it. And it's been there so long, actually, that it's that BuffaloTrace Distillery has achieved National Historic Landmark status. Now, what the hell does that mean to anybody who's not American on the tasting? Essentially, if other examples of National Historic Landmarks would include the White House, the Washington Monument, Mount Rushmore, the Golden Gate Bridge, the Hoover Dam, these are part of the fabric of the United States of America. And because BuffaloTrace is the oldest continuous running distillery, we were awarded that National Historic Landmark status as well. So again, a kind of a fun fact. BuffaloTrace was even permitted to distill during Prohibition, and the reason for that was for, as we say, medicinal purposes. And at that stage, there were no photo IDs or anything like that. So if you had an ailment, you went to your local practitioner, your local doctor, and he'd give you a prescription and send you off up to the it was the George T Stag distillery at the time with the prescription to get a little bit of spirit. But an interesting fact is that during the years of Prohibition, the population of Kentucky exploded literally within 6 months to about 3 times what they originally thought it was. And that's because people were going in on different days, giving different names to get different prescriptions and go up the road and get their tot of booze and keep the distilling industry going. So, and then at the end of Prohibition, it all collapsed again down to originally what it was. So, it's as I said, the oldest continuously running distillery in the United States, and distilling's been there since 1773. So the guys have their recipe, they have their bit of magic, they know exactly what's going to happen in each barrel on each floor, and continuing to do that every day.
And can I ask, George, they know, okay, they know in certain warehouses, certain racks, it'll behave a certain way. But does weather affect it, or does weather ever change that much year to year where it would actually affect the barrel?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's been a couple of interesting stories, Tom, have come out of the distillery. So I've been to BuffaloTrace in the height of winter, and I've been there in the height of summer. And in the height of winter, it's about -20, -25 degrees. It's incredibly cold. And then in the summer, as Ian mentioned, it's up in the 40s, and it's unbearably hot. For us poor pasty-skinned Irishmen, right? So the good thing about that is it means that those barrels expand and contract an incredible amount compared to what they would do in Ireland, right? So if you can imagine, the whiskey's getting soaked up during the day as the barrel expands, and it's getting wrung back out at night as the barrel contracts. But the weather, I suppose, look, there is a certain amount of wind chill. BuffaloTrace sits at the bottom of a valley, of the Frankfurt Valley, so it's pretty well protected from wind. So they don't get a lot of chill in the rack houses. As you'll see if you look over Ian's shoulders there, a lot of our rick houses, they're fully ventilated with windows, and the guys will literally control the temperature by opening and closing the window. The other thing interesting is BuffaloTrace Distillery was the first one to use steam from the distilling process to keep the warehouses warm in the winter. So what they used to do is they used to run steam pipes, and essentially, if you wanted to liken to underfloor heating in your bathroom, it just kept the place just that little bit warmer, and it kept the aging process going even in the colder winter months. So there was a very interesting story, and I won't waffle on too much, but the warehouse that's actually behind, that you guys see behind Ian there. One day several years ago, a tornado came down the Frankfurt Valley and ripped the roof off that warehouse. Now that's the oldest warehouse that we have in BuffaloTrace. I think it's there, if I'm not mistaken, since the 19th century. But the roof got ripped off, and because we're a National Historic Landmark, every building in our distillery is listed. So if we want to block up a window, open a door, we have to, you can imagine the amount of permission we have to go to with local government. So while the roof was ripped off, of course, there was wind, rain, sun, snow, everything going on these barrels for about a period of about 5 or 6 months. And then eventually they got the permission to repair the roof. And of course, the first job was to lift the barrels down because the rick had been damaged. And they lifted them down and they said, do you know what? Wouldn't it be interesting to just taste one of these rather than just tuck it away back into another warehouse? And at the time, it was E.H. Taylor is what was being aged up in the top floor there. And when they tasted it, they basically called everybody and said, "We think we're after discovering the best whiskey we've ever tasted." And they brought in distillers from other distilleries, other blenders. They brought everybody in from the distillery, and they all agreed that it was the best bourbon they'd ever tasted, but they had absolutely no idea why. And they didn't know if it was because of wind or sun or rain or snow or UV rays or ozone layer. They just hadn't a clue why. But they actually bottled it, and they then branded the product Colonel E.H. Taylor's Tornado Surviving Bourbon, and sold it in the state of Kentucky for, I think, about $100 a bottle, something like that.
Kind of normally is a little over normally.
But now, if you can find a bottle of that in a liquor store, you're probably likely to pay $6,000 to $7,000 for it. So it's become this holy grail of bourbon. Now, what Harlan Wheatley did when he signed on the dotted line to come and join and be our master distiller, just before he put ink on the page, he said, "I have one condition to coming to work for you in BuffaloTrace." And he said, "I want an experimental warehouse, and I want to try and recreate the E.H. Taylor Tornado Surviving Bourbon." And if you guys, after this, if you go onto BuffaloTraceDistillery.com, you'll see a kind of a live interactive map. And one of our smallest warehouses is this warehouse called Warehouse X. And Warehouse X is our experimental warehouse. It has 5 chambers in it. So one is a kind of a wind tunnel, and then it has 2 hermetically controlled chambers on either side of that. And there are 23 atmospheric conditions from wind, rain, sun. It has UV lamps. It's got wind fans. And they're all set up in these chambers. And what they do is they make the E.H. Taylor distillate. They put it into Warehouse D for a certain number of years, and they know the number of years that those barrels were there. Then they bring them up to Warehouse X, and Harlan, our master distiller, begins to play. And he will bombard them with UV or with rain or wind or whatever. And that was, if I'm not mistaken, I think about 15 years ago, and they have yet to recreate the bourbon. So their first experiment was they filled one chamber with about 10 barrels, and they said, right, we'll hit this one with UV light. And they hit it with UV light 24 hours a day for a year. And they were really excited, and they took down the first barrel and they disgorged it, they bottled it, and they went to try it, and it did absolutely nothing whatsoever to the bourbon, and they've wasted a year. But this was something that Harlan insisted on to take the job. But what they have learned is they have unlocked some other secrets that make really, really good whiskey. Some we share, some we don't share. And there's always a few bottles released each year of this, what they call the experimental collection. And this is another rare collection out of BuffaloTrace. So when an experiment goes well, sometimes they bottle it and sell it. And it'll be very, very limited release, maybe just 100 bottles into Kentucky and that kind of thing. But very interesting. So we keep experimenting. We're always trying to find what will unlock that mystery, but also what can we do to continue making ourselves the best distillery in the world? So that's always our mission on an ongoing basis. So in a very long-winded way, Tom, I hope that answers your question.
Indeed.
I think the most recent success from Warehouse X was E.H. Taylor's 4 grain. So that was 2019. I think
yes.
One of the whiskey.
2018, yeah.
2018, yeah. It did Redbreast 21 that year, I think. That was number 2. But yeah, it was. I think we couldn't get any bottles. I think we got a couple of bottles in Ireland eventually. But I know me and George were in Kentucky that summer, And I was in Louisville airport. We were waiting to fly down to New Orleans. And I went up to the bar and I was looking at the menu and I was like, oh, I haven't had the E.H. Taylor single barrel before. It's like, can I get a single barrel E.H. Taylor? And right, actually, don't have any single barrel left, but we do have this 4 grain. It just came in. I was like, what? I kind of stopped, tried not to explode, and was like, okay, I'll have 4, please. I myself then one, was a couple of other bartenders in George one. I just handed them this whiskey. It's like, each set of 4 grain, you're welcome. I think we finished about 3/4 of the bottle, I think, before we left. Amazing stuff. So the 4 grain was corn, rye, wheat, and malted barley. So the wheat just gave that extra dimension. But yeah, absolutely amazing stuff. But that's what comes out of Warehouse X, you know.
Made for an interesting flight, I'm sure.
Very interesting.
The whole trip was interesting, Tom.
Yeah. Anyway, on that fantastic note, we'll move on to Thomas H. Handy. So Thomas H. Handy is, again, we're staying with rye. It is the same mash bill as Sazerac 18, but you've gone out from a 18-year-old rye at 90 proof or 45% ABV to a 6-year-old. This is a 6-year-old in 2 months. This particular bottling is, and it's at 62.85%, or 125.7 proof in American money, and exact same mash bill. This particular bottling was aged in 3 different warehouses, so N, M, and K, all similar stone-clad warehouses, all similar styles and characteristics of aging. But you've kind of mixed the floors here, so you've a couple of mid floors and a couple of upper floors. Yeah, in the 6 years, they lost 26% of the barrel volume, so not too bad. But still, in 6 years, you've lost part of your distillate. It's quite a lot. But yeah, I would approach this one with a little bit of caution. If you need to cut it, do. But very gently. But I definitely ask you to try it neat as it is. And this is where you really need to chew. Get it in your mouth, get a little bit in your mouth and start chewing. Keep your mouth kind of slightly open, or open your mouth as you're chewing, to let in a bit of air and let out some alcohol. And your saliva gland will naturally start to cut it, and it'll start developing and open up in your mouth. But it's a big guy. But it's one of the most probably underrated bottles from the Antique Collection, to be honest. For me, it's always been really, really good. So cheers.
Packs a good punch.
And a drop of water maybe made it a little bit sharper. A little bit, but the legs are fantastic on it. Gentle enough on the nose, but it does pack a real punch when you taste it.
Not gentle on the palate, yeah. Ooh, wow, man, that is spicy.
To cut the aging by 2/3 and like still end up with a really drinkable but very punchy whiskey, it's quite interesting, isn't it?
It's insanely different, but you get a lot more of that earthy ryeness. So with young rye whiskey, you kind of get like a more herbaceous kind of taste to the palate, and that's definitely there.
Mm.
But you got so much more dryness, so you get more dryness. More so, it's driven because the higher ABV of the rye. So rye in general is quite bold and spicy. But the higher the ABV, obviously that's intensified. So for me, this is incredibly like white pepper spice. Straight off the top of your tongue. Top of my tongue is burning. Like you just taste the white pepper, and it just rolls back across the top of your palate, and you have that real nice like corn sweetness across mid palate, and then that herbaceous kind of flavor kind of sits back towards the back of your tongue for me, and then it's just this intense dryness, probably from the barrel, and then probably from a bit of alcohol, so a bit of barrel influence. But yeah, it's really good, really good. Lots of almonds and kind of that clove, kind of cinnamon spice to it, like.
Guys, tell us how you find it as well. If you want to shout out or put a couple of comments in the chat, I'd love to hear what you think of it.
Or is everyone just enjoying it so much, like me?
There's definitely a mintiness off this one, Tom, off the nose, because very minty. Not necessarily a really sharp mint, but a more of a sweeter mint.
And then you can still pick up the brown sugar. synonymous with
like a
American
creme
whiskey.
brulee. Do you know, like that glaze in a creme brulee?
John, strong stuff, very warming all the way down. Couldn't agree more. That's no bad thing.
So this
The night's getting
particular
chillier.
bottle, actually, sorry Tom, I forgot to say, was
Right.
from 2019. We actually didn't have a 2020 release of Thomas H. Handy, because simply the barrels just didn't make the cut. And this happened again this year, actually, with George T Stag. So there's no George T Stag in 2021 release, but it's the barrels, if they don't make the cut, they don't make the cut, and we won't release something that we don't think is the best representation of Thomas H. Handy or George T Stag or any of the brands. And that's just the way it goes. We're very strict and stringent with what we release and how, you know, how that represents to the style of the brand. And obviously in 2020, the barrels picked for Sazerac 8 or Thomas H. Handy just didn't match. And it wasn't released, and I know that's what happened this year with George T Stag, but quite interesting to see that they just pulled the bottle. And we're not releasing it, it's not up to standard. So it's a pity, but look, if it's not right, well, it's not right.
And what would happen with those barrels if they don't make the cut there? Do they just continue maturing?
They get sold to Ian down at water.
Yeah, I wish I'd have a little warehouse back here. But did well, a couple of things. Well, they probably could just be left there and see will they evolve. I'm turning sometimes whiskey at 6 years old might not be necessarily be perfect, but we'll give it another 6, 8 years or 10 years or even another 12 years up to Sazerac 18. Well, maybe those barrels might have changed.
I suppose the other thing to say, Ian, as well is BuffaloTrace is one of 9 distilleries that we have in the United States, and if we have what we call a problem barrel like that, so let's say we have a rye and it was intended to be maybe Sazerac 18 or Thomas H. Handy, and it doesn't perform, it would probably, obviously in our portfolio we have a huge range of whiskies going from value all the way to ultra premium, so it will probably, the whiskey certainly doesn't get poured down the drain, as the fellow would say, right? It will probably go on to live its life as something else. But as Ian said, there are incredibly exacting standards around the antique collection. And that's all driven by Drew Mayville, who's our master blender. And he is, I can tell you, even when it comes, I've been in tastings with Drew, even for some fairly mainstream whiskies, and his standards are incredibly exacting. And if it's not quite right, it will not exist. It's as simple as that. If it's not right for that label, it's gone and it'll go off and live as something else. So typically what might happen is if we have a problem barrel, maybe a bourbon, it will go on to live its life as perhaps American whiskey. So it might have a bit of spirit added into it. It might be, dulled down a little bit, and it might go from the premium into the mainstream or something like that and go into one of our other brands. And certainly never wasted, but there are zero risks taken on the antique collection. Zero risks taken on any of our whiskies, but particularly the antique collection, or like Drew's children, unless it's right, it just will not go in the bottle. So that's why they're so highly coveted. And
such a huge call as well. Such a premium product, and just say no, it's not good enough.
Just a question there from John. Do we distill? I suppose do we sell barrels to other distilleries or third parties? Not really. We're currently in the middle of a $1.2 billion expansion to increase our own bourbon stocks without selling bourbon to anyone else, because we don't have enough for ourselves. So I don't know of it. And when you're building that much warehouses to try make more whiskey for yourself, I doubt it. George might know more, but I don't think so.
Yeah, I think maybe in the past, but like in the distant past. But certainly, since we've owned the distillery, as Ian said, we are, as a business, we're very, very conscious about building our brands and building them for the future. So if we have capacity in BuffaloTrace, we tend, when I say attend, I know we do, we hold it all for ourselves. And like Ian brings up a very interesting point there about the expansion of BuffaloTrace. So our CEO a few years ago signed off and you have to remember, our company, it's a private limited company. It's all owned by one man. The entire company globally. It's owned by one man. We're not like perhaps the Diageos of this world. We're not a PLC. But the owner of the company signed off a personal investment of 1.2 billion, that's with a B, $1 billion just in BuffaloTrace to expand our capacity there. And what that looks like is a series, and if you look at it on Google Maps, you'll see it. What we did was we bought a vast swathe of land further just beside us on the valley in Frankfurt. And we unfortunately had to cut down some trees, but for every tree we cut down, we planted 100 trees. So we actually bought other land to plant 100 trees for every one we cut down, and we have that actually certified. And we just got some, I don't know, arboretum status or some other thing like that. I don't know much about botany, but we're very green anyway. Be assured for the environmentalists on the tasting, right? But what we've done is we have installed a new still house, and the still, I don't know if any of you have ever seen a pot still or a column still, but the still that we have installed, I think, and Ian, correct me if the maths is wrong on this, but it distills about 220,000 litres at a time. Now, that is 4 stories high and about 40 feet wide. So it's similar to the fuselage of a plane. And that is, if you were to take a jumbo jet from the wings to the cockpit, that's kind of the size of the still that we're just after putting into BuffaloTrace. We had 8 fermenters, which were 290,000 US gallons each, which is somewhere around 750,000 litres, and we're after building another 12 of those. And then what we've done is we've built a load of warehouses as well. So the warehouses, it costs 7 million to run the distillate for a warehouse, and 21 million to worth of bourbon goes into each warehouse to fill the warehouse. So every time we fill a warehouse, it's costing the business something to the region of $30 million just in distillate and barrels alone. The warehouses are actually relatively cheap because it's just a warehouse, but it's actually the juice that goes into it is the expensive thing, and that's where most of our 1.2 billion is going after we've expanded the stills. But these are very modern rick houses, not like the ones behind myself and Ian here in our profile pictures. They're aluminium clad, they're fully thermally insulated, they're fully temperature controlled, so we can have a constant temperature flow throughout the entire warehouse, but we can also modulate it as well. So if we want something to slow down on the lower floor or the lower rick, we can slow it right down and we can actually cool it. Whereas if we want something fast, like a fast whiskey would be a 2 to 3 year whiskey in bourbon, we can put that up on the top. We can increase the heat and pump the hot air all the way up from the middle floors up to the top floor and actually accelerate the aging process. So they're very, very modern, but we're going to be building about 22 of those. And each of those will hold somewhere in the region of 70 to 88,000 barrels. So you can imagine the scale of production that we're going into at the moment. The reason for all of that, why are we doing that? Why have we gone to our owners and we need $1.2 billion? It's very simple. We can't produce fast enough for the American market. And if any of you, and I'm sure many of you have, ever been in a liquor store in the United States and asked if you can buy a bottle of BuffaloTrace, about 3 times out of 4, you will get a no, we're out of stock. The reason is we can't make it fast enough. So what we do is we have instigated a thing called a rolling blackout. And it means that we only permit our wholesalers to sell BuffaloTrace 3 weeks out of 4 in the month. And what that means is we can control the supply. We can make sure that all the wholesalers get some and all the liquor stores get some, but we know that they still don't get enough. We got to fill that gap. And to fill that gap over the next 25 years, or even for the next 10 years, will cost us something in the region of $1.2 billion to facilitate. So I suppose it brings up a very good point. The next time you're in your local supermarket or your local off license, if you're joining us from Ireland, and you see a bottle of BuffaloTrace, you're in a much wealthier position than a lot of our friends over in the United States, because if you go into a liquor store in the States, you'll see the BuffaloTrace label, but you won't see any bottles there. And I've actually, myself and one of our other colleagues, Alan, hosted a tasting in Cork several years ago in a bar for bartenders. And we were upstairs in this bar and all these heads started popping up around the corner, looking inquisitively at us. And we got talking to them. And they said, hey, we're here over here from Jacksonville in Florida. We hear you guys have a bit of Buffalo Trace. We're big Buffalo Trace fans, but we can't get any. And we said, well, here, there's a bottle. Come in and join us. And then we opened up a bottle of Eagle Rare, and they nearly lost their minds. They were actually FaceTiming home to their friends in Jacksonville, going, "Hey, look at the bottles we got." And the guy was like, "Oh my God, where are you? Are you in Kentucky?" And they're like, "No, we're in Cork in Ireland." So we're quite fortunate, I suppose, that if you know about Buffalo Trace, that we have it literally down the road in your supermarket store on the shelf there, whereas our poor old friends over in the States can barely get their hands on the stuff. So that's what we're doing to expand and meet global demand, because obviously in Ireland we're small enough that we don't need to be on allocation, but some of our bigger markets like the UK and France and Australia, they don't get what they need because we can't make it fast enough. So in future you are going to see more and more Buffalo Trace coming through. So
I've actually done some maths. Since 2017 we've built 10 new warehouses in Buffalo Trace. And in those 10 new warehouses, there's 117.5 million litres of bourbon.
Mind-blowing numbers.
Bloody bourbon.
So I just want to take a couple of questions from Darren there, a couple of points that he raises. Yes, certain states do get weighted allocations, Darren, and it's for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is, there's it's a kind of a blended algorithm, if you like. It's based on population. It's based on historical sales and demand. But the third reason as well is some states are control states, where the state controls all of the liquor stores. They control the journey of alcohol through them. So the likes of Pennsylvania and a couple of others like that. So it does vary a little bit. And the weighted allocations. So for example, in Pennsylvania, we essentially sell the bourbon to the government's wholesaler, and then they decide who goes out, who gets it, how much of it they get. We have absolutely zero influence on that because it's against the law for us to try and influence it. So we can't even say, "Hey, Darren's bar is looking for 2 cases of Buffalo Trace. Can you sort them out?" We literally can't even have that conversation. So it's the control states are, as they say, very, very, very controlled. So interesting point there, saying Texas gets a ton of Stag Junior compared to the others. I've got a couple of friends in Texas, so I must put the arm on them now to make sure I get hooked up when I go to visit them. So the Stag Junior is another tricky one to get your hands on. But I know the guys in the Celtic whiskey shop. I know we sort them out for a few bottles. So if you're looking for something for Christmas Day, have a nice tipple. I'm sure the guys in Celtic will sort you guys out.
I will say it's not currently on the shelves, but we did have it for a little while. Yeah, most of them went to online sales. It's the international, customers, they find out and straight away
they swoop in. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The one thing I will say to you guys, depending on where you're joining us, wherever you're joining us for, whether it be Ireland or further afield, we're always very happy to connect drinkers with our brands. So if you're in a corner of the world and you're looking for one of our brands, you need to know who's stocking it or where, be it retail or a bar or anything like that. We're always very, very happy to take an inquiry into the business and make sure you get connected with any of our brands. So I just want to say that obviously the guys in Celtic stock pretty much our full range. Whatever we have enough to sell them, obviously, but they're very supportive and great stock in a very big range of ours. So Darren, hope that answers the question. If it doesn't, please by all means fire in another comment there. We'll be happy to answer. Okay, cool. Right, over to one of my favorites.
Yeah, onto George T Stag. Just George T Stag. Just to tell you a little bit about George T Stag was before we get going. So George T Stag started working in distillery just as a general operative and worked his way up as a unit back when E.H. Taylor owned distillery when it was called the OFC, and eventually worked his way up high enough and got enough money together, and he actually bought the distillery when Taylor started to get into financial trouble just at the kind of start of Prohibition area. So the BuffaloTrace distillery was called the George T Stag distillery for many years. That's where the bourbon gets its name. So after one of our kind of founders and stuff. So George T Stag distillery has been said to be the grandfather of all bourbon, and this is the benchmark of what bourbon should taste like. And having tasted George T Stag several times, you won't be disappointed. I haven't tasted this release. This is the 2020 release we're tasting. So it's 65.2% or 130.4 proof. And it's cask strength, uncut, unfiltered. 15 years and 4 months old BuffaloTrace essentially, or Eagle Rare. It's the same mash bill. So what you're drinking here is really old BuffaloTrace, a cask strength, and that's, I suppose, it goes back to the DNA of a lot of our products. Is okay, you might be able to get George T Stag, but you might be able to get a Stag Junior in some places. And if you can't get a Stag Junior, well, maybe actually, yeah. I was just seeing Thomas's chat there. Yeah, that's correct. And yeah, you might be able to get Eagle Rare very easily on BuffaloTrace, but it's the same DNA. So if you guys do get a chance to have some Eagle Rare or BuffaloTrace in due course, that same DNA is there and you can taste it. So again, I would definitely approach this one with caution. This one is going to be big, it's bold, it's spicy, and compared to Thomas H. Handy, it's going to pack a lot more of a punch because it just does. It's older, it has more barrel influence. It's going to be spicier to a point, because you're going to get more. You're going to get those two different types of spice again. You have barrel spice and tannin spice, or barrel spice and rye spice. So our oldest whiskey we've had thus far has been Sazerac 18 and Eagle Rare 17, but both have been on lower ABVs. So they've both been sub 90 proof.
This is definitely one, guys. I'd say enough to wet your lips and the tip of your tongue and chew through it until you acclimatize to it. But if you do it that way, if you go with this too strong, you probably won't taste much till about midnight. But if you just a little sip, chew your way through it. For me, this is one of my favorite bourbons. It's and at the strength it is in the glass here, it's an amazing flavor journey. For me, it's absolutely standout. So, to your good health one more time.
Oh my!
It's huge.
That is phenomenal. I don't really have words at the moment. I'm still chewing it, and I swallowed it a good 15 seconds ago, and it's still just rolling and developing, and it's just as coming. But I think initially, off the top of my head, it's huge amount of a lot of spice. But it's like so much like big Christmas cake fruits, cherries, plums.
There's almost a cinnamony kind of note to it as well.
Yeah, it's just. That is one of the best George T Stags I've tasted for quite a while.
Before anyone asks, yes, cinnamony is a word. I've Googled it.
More cinnamon. Wow, it's phenomenal though. It's one of those you could literally sit for an hour over the smallest measure and just continue to explore and explore.
It's probably the best value bottle of whiskey you'll ever get, Tom, because you'll sip it so slowly and lengthen it out. Yeah, you'll have it for ages.
You put 20 ml in a glass and forget about it for 2 hours. Like it's just chew away. It's not one. I mean, it's not one where you get a shot of George T Stag and you go. It's not one of those. Like a measure of George T Stag, you should probably chew on for an hour. Otherwise, you're going to stand up probably after it anyway. Never mind enjoy it. But yeah, it's quite a beast. What's everybody's thoughts or thoughts about it, or is there any?
Shane there, Ian, is saying huge spice on the nose and a stronger caramel.
Yeah, there is. Yeah,
absolutely.
Absolutely.
With that.
That's just all that interaction with the resins drawing those tannins out of the barrel. That's really what you're getting on the nose there, Shane.
There's just depth of flavor, and it's layer upon layer upon layer of flavor. And as I haven't took sitting there for a couple of minutes, and it's still there, and it's the finish is still there, the flavor is still there, the profile still resonates in your palate. So it's quite phenomenal.
Might actually try with a drop of water now. See how that's.
John, appreciate your loyalty to the word cinnamony. Very much appreciated. If we use it enough, it'll end up in the dictionary. Actually, you know that, John.
That's how things go nowadays.
Cinnamony.
I think somebody described this to me before. We did myself and Ian hosted a tasting at Whiskey Live. And we look forward to seeing you all at Whiskey Live, all things being equal in the spring. Yeah, cross everything, right? But somebody described it to me. He said, it's like whiskey popping candy, because it's just when you think all the flavors are gone, another one kind of bursts in and it fires another taste bud. And I thought it was a great way to describe this whiskey. It just keeps releasing little pockets of flavor and new little tricks as it goes.
I mean, buttered toast I got.
I just had my third sip of it now, and I'm actually only now getting to the toffees and caramels, because I was just enjoying the spice and all that, the upfront liveliness of it. So it's kind of mellowing now and sweetening a little bit. How did you find it, Tom, when you opened it up with a little bit of water?
Actually, a lot of bubble gum, believe it or not, as an odd taste, yeah.
Bubble gum is quite typical out of BuffaloTrace distillate, especially now in our next distillate with Dwellers. Bubble gum is a very typical trait of some of the pappies and some of the wheat bourbons.
It's amazing when you get to your third and fourth sip of that, and I haven't cut it at all, and it's very. I suppose my mouth is adjusted now, and it's quite palatable, quite acceptable now at this stage. It's just that initial prickliness and liveliness is just starting to.
I actually remember that tasting, and yeah, it's absolutely horrendous how people just leave samples. These tastings. I would have nearly
last week at the Irish Whiskey Awards.
I mean,
I thrilled pints of it.
Yeah. And there was literally 100 quid just left on the table. But yeah, you didn't see me or George leaving dry or empty our way.
No, you behaved accordingly.
But the other thing, Darren, the interesting thing we see at the live tastings is people who come in and they might have had a mill or too many of whiskey, and they come in and we usually throw in a little bit of BuffaloTrace or Eagle Rare just to kind of warm them up to some of these bigger, punchier whiskies. And I've seen people come in and they get the little pour of George T Stag and they throw it back. And I've seen what it's done to them, and suddenly they're absolutely annihilated. And they go out, and the cold November air hits them in Dublin Castle, and I'd say it's a tough day the next day. But I've seen people literally shoot this stuff. Yeah.
You need to treat it with respect for sure.
So Tim, to answer your question on the aging of this, every drop of this is no younger than 15 years.
This particular bottling, Tim, is 15 years and 4 months.
Yeah.
So it's all as George said, George T Stag is guaranteed over 15 all the time. So and this bottling just came from three different warehouses, Elkane and Q. But they interestingly they came off the first floor, the second floor, and the ninth floor of some of the warehouses. So you have really low floors, and then obviously you have bloody high floor. So it's quite interesting. And for those 15 years, so it lost 60% of its volume from the barrels. So yeah, quite interesting. Obviously the ninth floor was there to balance, to bring something to some of the lower floors. But yeah, quite interesting. I'm gonna save some of that later till when I finish the tasting. Like I said,
I definitely did.
Just chew over it. Yeah.
Not every day you get a shot of it.
Drink it. Yeah, absolutely.
Did everyone like that one?
Do you everyone want to move on to? Yeah, everyone want to move on to winter weather, or do you want to? Me and George talk a little bit more about random stuff.
Just one thing, Ian. Just a little story I'll tell. You guys will notice I've changed my background, and if I duck out of the way a little bit. This is actually, if you, Ian, if you can lean to your left a second there, can you? I don't know if it'll work. You can actually just see the little green door there to the left, or to Ian's right. That's the entry door into this warehouse here. When you walk in, this is what you're looking down. This is kind of the corridor. Now, from floor to ceiling here, sorry, the background isn't really helping this out, but from floor to ceiling there is about 7 feet. So it's not quite a story. Like you would have in a building, and that's why I've just changed that there. But you can see Most of the barrels you're looking here are either some of the antique collection. There might be a little bit of Pappy as well, because it's what we call a slow floor. Because it's low, it's cooler, and that means we don't get the evaporation, don't get the angel share happening quite as badly in these barrels. You've heard us mention a couple of times, myself and Ian were there in July in 2018. And about 10 days before we arrived in BuffaloTrace, very sadly, in one of our distilleries in Barton, the Barton 1792 distillery, we had a warehouse collapse. Now, first and foremost, nobody was injured. It happened in the middle of the night. Nobody was there. But unfortunately, a rick gave way, one of these lower floor ricks, which is, these are the ricks here where they roll the barrels in. And one of these pillars gave way and the whole thing came down. Now, why is it 1792? 1792 is the year that the state of Kentucky was formed. And that's what this is one of our bourbons that it commemorates. And we and many other of our businesses around the world had a monumental rush on 1792 bourbon, because somebody out there in the blogosphere convinced the world that we were going to run out of 1792. And it's quite a popular bourbon. And well, two things to tell you. Number one, it was there was no bourbon in the warehouse that collapsed. It was all rum, actually, so it was fine. But we didn't say no to the sales. But myself and Ian, 10 days later, were standing actually in this corridor here that you can see with a load of clients. And what happens is, in July, when the windows are open, the building stays still, but the ricks move slightly in the wind, and it creaks quite loudly. And we brought some clients there, and they were going, "Oh, this is amazing," or "Wow, the creaking is really interesting." Myself and Ian were looking at each other. I swear to God, I didn't go further than about 5 feet from the door, because I was absolutely terrified that 30,000 barrels was going to come down on my head. So that's why I just wanted to change my background and just show you that corridor. So, and by the way, that warehouse is, of course, completely haunted. And you can come to BuffaloTrace, and if you can do your tour, have dinner, and then you can do a second tour at night, and there's a ghost tour. And I believe about once a week, people end up screaming and running out of the ghost tour, because it is apparently haunted. So there you go.
It's quite unusual to walk around the bottom floor of that warehouse, because when you walk around, and all our barrels are stamped pretty much BuffaloTrace, which is mash bill number 1. For Sazerac Rye, it's Sazerac Rye. For the Weller, for the wheated bourbons, is Weller. So we don't distinguish when we barrel all these bourbons. They don't distinguish whether it's going to be a Pappy, or whether it's going to be an Eagle Rare, or whether it's going to be an E.H. Taylor. It doesn't happen. It is BuffaloTrace, which is our mash bill number 1 mash. You've Sazerac Rye, which is our rye mash, and you've Weller, WL Weller, which is our wheated recipe, which is Pappy, which is Wheaten Maru Weller here. So it's all about the placement of the barrels, and that's kind of what's unique. But then every so often you see a sticker with like experimental on it, and it's just this big fucking X, big red X, and it's quite fun. It's quite interesting going what's going on in there, because you've no bloody idea. But yeah, it could be the world's next best whiskey, but you just don't know. Yeah, I think we'll move on to WL Weller next. So this is, I think, my favorite.
Kind of don't want to. I'm really enjoying that George T Stag.
Yeah, I know.
Get a fresh glass.
Yeah.
Wheaten Weller is our next one. So this is, I saved this for me because it, and I got to choose the run order, so I saved the best to last, in my opinion. So,
I think we should probably open by explaining,
yeah,
the mash bill here, Ian.
So the mash bill, we're flipping out from, I suppose, a corn rye malted barley mash bill we've had for Eagle Rare, for George T Stag, to a corn wheat and malted barley. So we dropped the rye grain, and what wheat does to bourbon is it adds a much more creamier, oilier, kind of butterier mouthfeel to it, and you lose that spicy element. So it's quite unique in what it does. And it was the whole wheat recipe came back from like Pappy Van Winkle days, back in the early 1900s. So when Pappy took over, started working at the W. Weller and Sons, he got Stitzler's distillery to make him some bourbon. So he wanted an all Kentucky bourbon to sell. So rye, most of the rye grown in are distilled in Kentucky, all comes from Indiana. So he wanted a Kentucky only spirit. So that's why he wanted corn, wheat, and malt barley. So that was all grown in Kentucky, and he uses Kentucky spirit. So that's a lot of the Weller brands get their wheat from, as well as the Pappy from Winkles. But yeah, it's utterly different. I suppose I would say
I think as I always say, Ian, people say, why do you take out rye and put in wheat? The simplest way to put this is wheat does to bourbon what sandpaper does to timber. It just makes it just a little bit smoother. It's the easiest way I can think of to describe it to somebody. It just means any of those slightly sharper corners that you're like, well, I like most of it, but I'm not sure about this, that, or the other. You'll find it just runs true and smooth, and that's why we leave it till the last.
Yeah, and this particular bottling, so this is the 2019 bottling, and it's 64% ABV, and it's 12 years and 6 months old. So, again, this time actually it's all from warehouse I, again, which is quite unusual to be one singular warehouse, but you can see it's on the second and third floors, so it's still quite low, so low and slow. But I'm starting to get into the kind of the mid tiers. For over the 12.5 years, it lost 57% of its volume in the barrel, so quite a lot of barrel interaction. But there's not much to say about Weller, only really just savor it, enjoy it, and cheers.
Cheers.
Wow, it's as good as I remember.
Oh man, it's better.
It seems really arrogant to say this because we're the guys who sell this stuff, but that's an incredible whiskey, and I mean that with absolute humility. To me, it's just absolutely fabulous.
It's
so Darren, you mentioned your friend who had a bit of trouble with Blue Spot. This is slightly stronger than Blue Spot, but it sure doesn't drink like a cask strength whiskey.
No, it's so smooth.
And there's
only a little kind of tingle at the end.
You can get the difference straight away when you start thinking about how your mouth is feeling at the moment. So that spiciness to the top of your tongue is gone. That doesn't happen now, because that was the rye straight off the white pepper kind of rye typical rye flavor. That's gone. So any spice you're getting is just solely barrel spice out of this, and it's all inside your cheeks, and it's all those extra tannins are there, so that from the barrel, from the oak of the barrel. But yeah, it's quite special.
Without being too descriptive, you just keep salivating, like it just keeps releasing more and more and more in there. Yeah,
it's just so good.
So Darren, I see your a couple of notes there. We have, through tastings like this, the popularity of Weller is slowly but steadily increasing. This one we're drinking now is obviously the William LaRue Weller, which is part of the Antique Collection. There are a couple of others. There's the Weller Special Reserve, and then there's the Weller 12-year-old. And the Weller 12-year-old, somebody likened it before to a slightly lower proof Pappy 12. And that went out in an article, and suddenly there was this land grab for Weller 12, which is it's a different bottle, but it's kind of the squat pot still looking bottle with the black and gold on it. And I think it's the reason it's rumored to be equal to Pappy is because coming off the still, it's the same distillate as Pappy, and it's aged the same amount of time. Now the warehousing is different and the proof is different, but it is the same distillate, and that's where a lot of those comparisons do get drawn to it. And I think you mentioned a bar in Belfast. I'd be surprised if that wasn't Bootleggers, because I know Bootleggers in Belfast. Those guys are big bourbon fans. Oh, it wasn't. Okay, interesting. But the thing with Weller is it is out there. We do try and get it into the right kind of whiskey emporium style bars. You mightn't get it in your local suburban bar, but certainly if you see Buffalo Traces on the cocktail menu, there's a pretty good chance. So in some of those bars that they might have a bit of Weller or indeed Pappy and that kind of thing as well, because they're the ones that I suppose if they're working with us on our brands, we'll work with them and giving them some allocation and that kind of thing is kind of the way it works. And indeed, it would be remiss of me not to mention the guys obviously in the Celtic Whiskey Shop, because I was lucky enough to host one of the earliest Pappy Van Winkle and Antique Collection masterclasses at Whiskey Live, and I think our first Whiskey Live was probably around 2017. And I actually put it to the audience. I said, look, I don't get much of this stuff, like literally bottles of it. What's the fairest way to do it? And in the tasting, we actually took a vote. And the unanimous vote was to run lotteries. And thankfully, Ali and Tom and the guys in Celtic Whiskey were very supportive of that idea. And basically the way it works is when we run a lottery, and we try and do about one a month between Pappy and the Antique Collection. And the way it works is that if you buy the likes of Buffalo Trace or Eagle Rare, or indeed any Buffalo Trace distillery products, your name goes into a hat. And at the end of the month, the guys in Celtic Whiskey will draw a name out of a hat, and they will offer you the opportunity to buy. It might be a bottle of Antique Collection, it might be one of the Pappies, but they will sell it to you at what we call a fair retail price, as opposed to you trying to buy it on an online bidding site for $2,000 or anything like that. We actually, as a business, we hate that, because these products, we sell them out at a fair price, but because their popularity and their rarity, of course, people start adding zeros onto it. And we as a business do not approve of that. We don't like that at all. And any of you have seen programs like The Heist on Netflix or anything like that, you'll know we come down pretty hard, and we encourage the feds to come in pretty hard when somebody is acting the maggot with one of our brands, right? But so I do have to take the opportunity to say thanks to the guys in the Celtic Whiskey Shop, because they really do a fantastic job in helping us out with running the lottery and getting these bottles to you guys in full at a fair price. Because sometimes what happens is, a store will get a bottle, and what they'll do is they'll decant it into 100 ml bottles, and they'll sell it off for a fortune. But again, that's not something that we like either. We would much rather people have the full experience and have the full bottle and get to enjoy it with some friends, because as Freddie, who's one of our lead guides in Buffalo Trace, will say, the most important thing when you get your hands on a good whiskey is to share it with a friend, is to actually crack the seal on the bottle, pull the bung out, and pour a couple of measures and have an experience with a friend. So that's why we try to get the lottery up, because we really want these bourbons in. They're far better off in bars or in your booze lockers at home than they are sitting in our warehouse. So we always try and push them out just as much as we can.
No, I think anybody have any other questions on anything, or anything you'd like to ask us, or I'm still chewing out with the weather. It's Jesus Christ, it's phenomenal.
Oh my, yeah. Again, it's same as a stag. You could just sit over for an hour, the smallest measure. Another great value one, George, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, for when you get these bottles of retail, they are very good value. But it's getting them at retail is the issue, and it's people overcharging in secondary markets, and but it is what it is. And George said we do our best to stop that, but it can only go so far.
Yeah, I know not everyone's a huge fan of the lottery system, but it is the fairest way. It's blindly done, name and a hat.
Well, I think Tom, to be fair, the lottery system in the United States, in some areas, has earned a bit of a bad reputation, because it's the lottery has in fact been for the stores, not for the customers. But we've been very keen that the lottery is for the actual consumers themselves. So in some states, we will, a distributor or a wholesaler will get 100 cases of Pappy, and they will have a lottery for which other wholesalers get it or which stores get it. That's still not getting bottles into people's hands and into their homes, Yeah. So we'd much rather that it's direct to consumer, and that's where the lottery sits, because that way it's absolutely fair.
The kosher stuff, Darren, I see your chat. I actually haven't tried the kosher stuff, and I actually don't know a whole lot about it. It's something that just doesn't pop up over here a whole lot. Oh, I can't.
Funnily enough, we were only talking about auctions. We actually had a bottle come through our auction of
Has he?
BuffaloTrace kosher. Yeah,
I saw
not
that.
sure what it went for. Yeah.
I know absolutely nothing about it, and I won't pretend to ask or try talking about it because I actually don't know.
I know the one thing and to echo what Ian said, just purely out of been not being able to get very much of it at all, if at all, this end of the Atlantic pond, Darren. But I know my counterpart who heads up our business over in the UK, they got a few cases and they did a bit of testing on it to check its popularity, and it was deemed as passable, but not something that would warrant a container traveling across the Atlantic. And of course, when it comes to global shipping issues and that kind of thing, I think the idea has just been put on hold for the time being. But I think certainly something that would be, worth assessing for the future. But it will, of course, will depend on demand, because sometimes it's, if we were to bring in a product like the kosher and sell it here, if we're bringing it in such small quantities, it can be very expensive for us to move it, and it can put the price out of reach, which would not be good for the brand. So sometimes you're better off with those things ending up in the likes of an auction room and that kind of thing, where people might want to, the likes of the Celtic whiskey auction, where people might just want a bottle as a as a once off or something like that. So, but it's something we are turning our eye to, is looking at various different preferences for people, be it kosher. There's a lot of these. Also, particularly when it comes to food, I mean, like veganism is growing, all these kind of things as well. So we have to make sure that our products are suitable for as many consumers as we possibly can. It's something that we're always innovating towards. So watch that space. And I hope that in a non-politician's way that answers your question. But we.
Yeah, I actually wouldn't mind getting off the banger and trying that, because I haven't tried any of the kosher stuff, none at all. So I think it's one of the few products I think from BuffaloTrace, Distilleries, George, we haven't got our hands on over the last 4 years or so. But yeah, the early days, yeah, you never know.
There's always time.
There's always time, Tom, yeah.
So does anyone kind of have a favorite among the 5 that we've had? Maybe you could pop it in the chat. What's the winner?
I see Shane diving for the keyboard here.
Come on, double weather.
Yes.
Okay.
You're 17.
17.
That's left of field for me now, to be honest.
Weller, Eagle Rare. Wow.
Brilliant. Eagle Rare 17, the dark horse.
I wouldn't have backed that one, even though it's kind of like comparing a 99 out of 100 whiskey to a 98 out of 100 whiskey.
Yeah, you're not really too far wrong, to be honest, Tom. Yeah. I think it's I find it very fortunate to work for Sazerac and BuffaloTrace when I get to do tastes like this and drink whiskeys like this, because genuinely we do get to taste some of the best bourbon in the world, and that's not been in any way cocky or anyways. It is essentially the best bourbon in the world, and there's very few bottles anywhere that can compete with this stuff. So yeah, it's always great to try it, and it's always great to get customers to try it, because they're just so hard to get. But yeah, I think that's hopefully we'll see a lot more of these, and for me, I can't wait for Whiskey Live. You will definitely find me and George in Tappy tasting in one of the rooms and the T collection tasting. And don't be afraid to come up and chat to us, and don't shout abuse at us, at least in public.
No, you have to take us. You have to take us out and give us a few drinks first before you start shouting abuse at us. No, but I think in all seriousness, I think it's something that we're starting to see some chinks of light and normality, and I think for us as an industry, and obviously you guys as whiskey appreciators, I think Whiskey Live is going to be a huge step forward in that. I'm really, really looking forward to that next year. So as Ian says, don't be afraid to come and find us. We'll have mainly BuffaloTrace and Eagle Rare on the stand, but we may have a bottle of something nice on the stand if you talk nicely to us as well outside of the masterclass. You never know. We always have a bottle of something.
There's always a bottle of something. Something.
I always say no, and then I get talked back out of like you have to have
Yeah.
something there, George. So yeah, we'll usually have a bottle of something, but and of course we'll have the very much look forward to the master classes as well. So yeah, so that's great. Can we take any more questions, comments, abuse? We'll leave for another time, but if there's anything else if we can do, please by all means shout out.
No, but no, thank you very much. If there isn't, thank you very much, folks. Genuinely been a pleasure. Yeah. See it all. Whiskey Live is really the segment of the evening. By
Yeah, it seems to
That's
be
it
in the
indeed.
comments. Yeah, I'll be working, so don't mind me.
Well,
It's not really work though, Tom.
Well, wink, wink. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see.
I think
We'll see you on the stand at about 9:30 in the morning. And there, do you want to drop it out?
Exactly. It's called breakfast malt. You know.
Go lovely on your Weetabix. Guys, listen, if that's it, thank you very, very much for joining us. It's been hope to see you all live at Whiskey Live. Thanks very much for giving us a chunk of your Saturday evening, and hope to see you all again very soon.
Cheers. Thank you very much, folks. We'll see you soon.
Cheers, guys. Bye bye.
Guys, thanks.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, George.
See you.
Absolute pleasure. Cheers.